speaker today we have is Karl Richter. I would probably call him a jack of all trades, especially when it comes to impact measurement, but also management, who's going to have a more internal focus on the organization and the management focus. And then we have Roberto Randazzo, who's becoming, I think, a central figure in impact investing, especially on the legal side as the president of ESELA, the legal network for impact. And it's quite nice that we actually have Gianluca Gaggiotti from EVPA joining. I just saw him in the waiting room. One of our friends in EVPA also shaping the field. And Roberto is going to focus more on legal aspects, obviously, but also on the connection between organizations and the broader landscape, so that we have sort of both perspectives coming in here. So I would just pass it on to Karl. You're very welcome to introduce yourself and add to what I already said. And we would have the presentations first, 15 minutes each. As I said, whenever you have questions, please gather those in the chat so that we can get back to those. And then we'll have a full half hour for discussion, which used to be quite dynamic in the last webinars. So I'm very looking forward to that. And I'll just pass the floor to Karl now.
That's great. Thank you very much, Gorgi, and great to connect with everybody on the call. So maybe a little bit of background in terms of context and the approach that I'm taking, or the direction I'm coming from. So I'm the executive director of a company called EngagedX, which is a small consulting company focusing on impact investing and impact measurement management, doing a little bit of tech development. I also lecture at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management in sustainable finance, so very much connected to mainstream finance. And I've done some consulting for the UN as they were trying to promote impact investing, and also a small amount for the OECD and such like. So I think this first question or first issue that Gorgi asked us to look at, what is the difference between measurement and management, is quite critical. And I normally introduce that right at the beginning of my lectures and try to explain that, impact is quite a personal experience for many people. Everyone will experience things in a different way. And so often there are a lot of different insights, and it becomes quite challenging to, separate all of those different interpretations. And so the big challenge really moving from measurement to management is about building that knowledge base to improve somebody's judgment, ultimately for decision making and influencing how organizations make decisions, individuals make decisions, investors make decisions, and so forth. So I think there's certainly been a big trend and a shift. Well, let's just say things, for a long time, people were very focused on measurement from a compliance perspective, often associated with risk management and understanding how non-financial risks might translate into financial issues. And what we're talking about here is going a lot deeper and actually understanding the non-financial impacts that are happening, and how do we then use that understanding of the positive and negative impacts of our operations to feed back into decision-making, executive decision-making, so that it becomes a really tangible part of the management team and is totally appropriate for them. So it's not an abstract concept in terms of just reporting onwards. Yes, there is that element, but it's also critical to see this as a useful tool and part of the core, let's say, toolkit of management. I also have a few slides that we can maybe share, and then I can talk to those. So I'm just going to see if I can get my screen to share, and it should start in a couple of seconds. And if we're lucky, you should see something happening about now.
Yes.
Gorgi, can you just confirm that the screen is sharing?
Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So this slide I wanted to put up because for me it's a good conversation starter. It emerged out of a number of experiences with the OECD and the UN, and trying to balance different requirements, whether that is large multinationals, development agencies, whether it be investors, whether it be large corporations, small startups, and so forth. and really trying to harmonize all the different ways that impact management is discussed and described, and trying to simplify that and trying to deconstruct a lot of the labels that people use, and trying to then communicate in very simple language, what's really going on, and is there just one approach, or are there multiple different approaches, and when are the different approaches appropriate and relevant? And so I found it quite helpful to talk about a spectrum of different approaches that we can organize from very low levels of methodological intensity on the left of the slide, the red and the orange, and then evolving or extending into more intensive, methodologically intensive approaches. And the point I try and emphasize here is that it's really important to realize that there's no hierarchy here. It's about finding the methodology and the approach, the pathway that is appropriate for you based on your size, scale, resources that you have, the expertise that you have. And I think it's almost more important to be clear and honest about what you're doing when it comes to impact management, or being very clear about what you expect if you're a funder, whether that be philanthropic or an investor. And we can overlay a process onto that, so from top to bottom. And again, very simple language. The listeners are probably very familiar to a large extent of different ways of describing the impact management process. And whether that's 8 steps or 6 steps or 3 steps, I think people will recognize this overall approach. And I think the point to emphasize here is that although it looks linear in this diagram, it's really important to emphasize that this is a circular process. It's iterative, and the emphasis is on taking action based on what you find out from managing impact. And so therefore it goes back into this idea of informing decision making. We can maybe also talk a little bit about different attributes of what's going on, and there's on the left more of a tendency towards reactive approaches, whereas on the right more proactive approaches, and what differentiates those perhaps is the introduction of a worldview. So roughly in the middle there we see a split, where on the right hand side of that it's really important to also be aware that those more intensive management approaches tend to also embody the worldview of the person doing the assessment, the ethics, the moral frameworks and so forth that they have, and that becomes embodied in their assessment. And particularly if you're looking at deeper stakeholder engagement, their worldview will inform what their interpretation is of what happens. So we can maybe throw up just a few more bullet points, and people can read that. I won't necessarily read that in detail. What I would like to do is maybe move on to the next prompt that Gorgi gave us to talk about. And Gorgi, you were interested in maybe talking about what kind of governance mechanisms need to be in place. And I wanted to be a little bit provocative and say none, because to some degree impact management I would see operating at a slightly deeper level than governance. So preceding governance, it's very much of a deeper awareness and something that covers all forms of governance, because it's fundamental and intrinsic to understanding what you're doing. What I think is maybe more of a relevant issue, and it's becoming particularly relevant at the moment, is having an understanding of materiality. And so what we're certainly seeing with the work that's been done by, for example, the UNEP, that's the UN Environment Programme, through their finance initiative, and within that they've got a working group focusing on positive impact. They're really focusing on trying to understand the different areas of impacts, the different thematic areas. So, for example, issues like healthcare or nutrition or biodiversity, water and so forth, climate change. And they're trying to understand the interrelationship between that and economic activity, so that we can start using economic activity as a as a source to then and orientate ourselves around seeing, well, which impact areas are then material based on that activity. So, for example, something like mining would obviously have a very material impact on the natural environment, the employment of people, the use of energy and resources and waste and so forth. And although you might serve food in the canteen, and I'm sure of a mine, and you would promote that as being very healthy food, really the nutritional content there is not a major issue in terms of the organizational impacts. So it would be quite helpful having a general move towards, globally towards more normative guidance or normative expectations around, what are the impact areas that are materially relevant for different types of organizations, and use that as a starting point. And I think that might also be quite helpful for a lot of people who might be beginning this journey with impact management. Georgie, I'm looking at the time. That's brought us to about 15 minutes in. Very happy to maybe take one or two questions as prompts, or
I think if there's
sharing my screen.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Karl, for also the provocation. Governance doesn't matter. Materiality matters. Something that I actually already am collecting in the chat. A question from my side. If there's any direct reactions or questions, something that intrigued you, happy to take that right away. And otherwise, I would suggest we let Roberto go first, right after you, and then we can go into the discussion in a combined fashion, so to say, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Gorgi. Thank you, Karl. I take the provocation immediately, because I would like to approach directly the impact field with a practitioner approach. I mean, representing lawyers involved in this field. When Karl, Gorgi, and me, we organized this webinar, the idea was to show how the legal community in the last 5 years organized a sort of network in order to discuss, deepen, develop, support the growth of the impact economy. And we did that through an organization, ESELA, the Legal Network for Social Impact. Let me share with you my slides. Here I am. Okay. This organization is an association UK-based, and it takes origin from an activity that we ran together with the EU Commission. The idea was to run a mapping study across the EU countries in order to understand and evaluate if and how the social enterprise, the local approach to social enterprise was or not aligned in some way. And this is the result that we published on our website. But we took the occasion from that mapping study about the possibility to start to create a group expert in this field. And we did it. We set up this organization working in the field that you can see in this slide. And our approach was to connect policies, to connect academic approach to communities, to the ground. The organization is made by lawyers, and part of us, we are linked also to the scientific world, the Academy of Business Schools. But the approach is to analyze how impact investing is dealt with in the market, how the players run impact investing activities, and how the different jurisdictions started to draft a regulatory framework for this topic or not. Starting from that moment, we understood that globally there was a small community linked to the legal side of the impact investments. And we started to create links together with our colleagues overseas, starting from the US and Latin America. In the US, there is a group, Impact Investing Law Working Group, linked to the Granting Center for Social Entrepreneurship based at NYU. In Latin America, Abogados B, colleagues that started to approach this area through the lens of the B Corp organization. And the B Corp, the Benefit Company Bar Association in the US too. We understood that the approach to this field was fragmented. I mean, the common denominator is impact, but the approach that lawyers had was different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And this was the first step that we have taken, create links in order to better understand the role played by colleagues in different parts of the world, and the idea to create a common path in order to better understand the legal profile of this field. And we did it through activity linked to other organizations. Some example, we collaborated with GSG, the Global Steering Group for Impact, and local NABs. Obviously, I put on this slide my NAB, the Social Impact Agenda per l'Italia, which is the Italian NAB, National Advisory Board to the GSG. But we did also with the organization linked to this field for different reasons, as AVPA is European Venture Philanthropy Association, or we started to approach Asia Venture Philanthropy Network. This week is the annual meeting for AVPN, and we organized the first meeting together with Asian colleagues in order to create a link also in that region. Just to conclude this brief overlook about global organization working in this field, let me recall IBA. IBA is the widest organization for lawyers, and there is a committee, the Business Human Rights Committee, working on this topic internally into the IBA organization. So this means that lawyers, practitioners, in some way are organized in order to support or to participate in the path that colleagues are coming from the scientific world or from the policy side are working on in order to understand if and how we can create a regulatory framework. Some topic related to our approach, I mean, the practical one in the legal field. Firstly, I have to say that the global debate I'm participating to, it's probably not so well developed as Karl explained during his speech. In some way, sometimes I hear about ESG transformation to something different. Somebody is saying that impact economy is ESG with a bigger S than in the past. This is obviously an approach that we have to consider, to take into consideration, but the role it is to increase and to support a sort of contamination between scientific world, academics, or other players involved in this field with the jurists, so with lawyers and practitioners. Something is happening because we received last year the TEG final report. This is the first taxonomy about green economy and sustainable finance. Is not perfectly aligned to the field that Karl drafted to us before, but probably could represent a first step, not about the content, but about the way to approach this taxonomy. We need to shape the frame of impact economy in order to better understand who is in and who is out, because the main risk that we have to face today is about impact washing. We had for greenwashing, and the same will come also for impact washing. I have to say that coming from a civil law jurisdiction, I have to point out that the global debate is about two different approaches. The one represented by civil law jurisdiction or lawyers, we are waiting for regulations, we are waiting for rules, we look for legal framework. And colleagues coming from Anglo-Saxon experience, from common law, they approach impact economy in a different way. They approach it through the fiduciary duties that investors have to attend in order to invest money in this field. So as you can understand, two different approaches in order to create possibly a least common denominator. I think personally that impact measurement is crucial and it's central in this debate. It's central because could represent the way to point out those crucial aspects related to the impact economy. And measurability and tools linked to measurement today represents a way to point out the intersection between investors and targets. I mean, investors in this field are looking for something different from the financial return. And this something different is to be necessarily linked to new measurement tools. Measurement represents a key to bring out the value, a value that's before today nobody started to measure or to consider relevant in a financial approach to the market. I think that today measurement represents an essential key for a toolbox, for a jurist toolbox. We started to draft clauses related to the measurements when we assist investors, because they are waiting for something different from only financial return. And for that reason, some clauses are related to the non-financial results of these investments. And finally, today, if we have to consider the denomination and the definition coming from the scientific world, from the academic, about intentionality, measurability, and additionality, the triad of the impact, we have to consider that in these legal tools, these three elements have to be represented in those clauses that I was referring to before. Very briefly, in order to move to the conclusion and to give you another concrete result of this of the discussion and the conferences that we had in the last year, studies about hybrid legal entities. Hybridity today represents part of the whole system in order to run this impact approach to markets. Is the legal entities side, not the financial side. And what's happening today is that in different jurisdictions, we do assist at specific regulation or laws about these hybrid legal entities. Social enterprises, for instance, in different jurisdictions as Italy, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, or B Corp or benefit corporation in jurisdiction where the law is, as Italy or Colombia, or on the other hand, the possibility to create hybrid from a different approach, as the UK did for community interest company, or the US did for low limited liabilities companies. So just to conclude, I think that the whole frame related to impact economy is to be considered from different perspectives, financial side, legal entities side, and measurement probably today represent the three different pillars linked to the legal approach to the impact economy. Gorgi, I give you back the floor.
Perfect. That's wonderful time management. I don't know how you guys are doing it. Same for the very first one that we had and the second that I was moderating. So everyone's sticking to their time, to the minute. So I think that's wonderful because we'll have a lot of room for discussion. I'd like to follow up maybe with something that's relevant to both of you, but maybe going back to Karl's argument about materiality first. I was asking myself when you were talking about materiality for who? Well, obviously, if you're considering impact and if that's your main priority, it's going to be materiality for the target group. But is that actually always the case, especially when you have this intersection between social entrepreneurship or other social ventures and impact investing? So is materiality always the same in terms of what's relevant to the target group, what's relevant to the organization, and what's relevant to the investor? And maybe even if we sort of broaden the perspective, the regulatory framework, the governing organization, so to say, that also play a role there. So what would be your response to that?
Yeah, that's a great question to open up the debate a bit more. And the context there, I think, sits in what Roberto was saying in terms of, you know, globally and across organizations, we're still moving towards and working towards clearer, more universal regulatory frameworks. So the reality is that the answer to the question is a little bit broader and a little bit vaguer than maybe a lot of people would like at the moment. But let's just sketch out what some of those tensions are and what we might think about. So on the one hand, you've got, as you were saying, you know, very much a very granular bottom-up aspect to the issue, looking at the front where an intervention is happening or an organization is working or a project or a program is happening, and looking at stakeholder engagement at that level and really drilling into the detail of how does this activity affect the people and what is their sense of what is appropriate and important for them, and really not having any preconceptions about that, but really seeing what is important for them based on their priorities. And so that's very, very different from, let's just imagine ourselves in another situation, you know, in an organization like the UN or the OECD, that is a multinational organization that is looking at a very, very high level and looking at a number of different issues and trying to organize and orientate themselves around, you know, challenges relating to planetary boundaries, issues around, you know, foundations of social well-being, and what are the really, really big primary issues that, you know, are of collective importance for everyone on the planet, and how do we manage our collective action and progress towards either redressing some of the harmful aspects or promoting and developing more of the positive. And so it's a very, very different situation over there, where we do need a much more top-down orientation. We do need to follow you know, scientific evidence to first work out, you know, what is the arrangement of planetary boundaries, what is going to be important, because we can't focus on everything. And then using that and somehow having an orientating framework that allows us to then drill into where the impact is actually happening, where it's being created positively, or if there's harm, you know, negative impact. And again, touching on what Roberto was saying with the EU taxonomy, we see there the beginning of how the materiality issue is coming to bear. So although the EU taxonomy is currently focused, you know, quite narrowly on issues around climate change, and let's say the green agenda in that sense, so very consciously and self-aware, it's not going broader into other ecological issues, and certainly not necessarily going into the depth of social issues that a lot of people want. But what we do see is that the starting point is to look at identifying, well, in terms of the higher level, the bigger, you know, planetary boundary issues, which economic activities have a very significant effect. And so to then, you know, look at saying, well, how do we then organize signals to suggest to different organizations, you know, what are your appropriate emissions? For example, if you're an aluminium smelter, what is an appropriate level of carbon dioxide emissions? And if you're a farmer, what is an appropriate level of emissions, so that you can then manage your organization and know that by doing that, you're doing it in the context of working towards global objectives. And I think maybe to give people, again, talking about this idea of judgment, to give people a little something to maybe keep in the back of their mind. If we think about financial materiality, it deals roughly with this idea of, do we have access to appropriate information that are relevant for us to make a decision? And if we did not have access to that information, would we have made a different decision? So that's a little bit of a vague answer at the moment, but it's in the context of a lack of regulatory framework. But I think it can be a guiding principle in addressing that issue.
Mm-hmm. So what I found interesting is that basically you're making the argument that on the one hand side, it needs to be a tailored approach in terms of if you're looking at this as an organization, in the sense of really maybe go in there without preconceptions, talk to your target group, find out what matters to them. And at the same time, you actually need this codification of certain standards, especially in the environmental area, where you can actually sort of set the target, so to say, and those to meet at some point. How that process is going to happen is still open, but you actually need this bottom up and top down, it seems to me. Roberto, maybe to get you in through a broader question relating to governance frameworks. I'm always asking myself, do the SDGs actually help, getting at materiality, maybe even prevent impact washing, or do they actually open up spaces to do this? I mean, the background of my question is, isn't it always some sort of reference frame that organizations can relate to in some way? So my feeling sometimes is, as long as you can relate it somehow to the SDGs, it's already labeled impact. What you were saying, we need to make sure that not everything, as Mario Calderini is also saying it in one of the videos of MOOC, not everything is impact all of a sudden, because then nothing is impact. So what's your view on that in terms of a broader governance perspective, and then maybe also in terms of how do you make this part of a legal contract to sort of force someone to actually live up to their expectations?
Being fellow of Mario at Politecnico Milan, I am on the same page in some way. I think that the risk is very high, not only about the possibility to create a common vision and a possibility to have a strict and common definition, as Karl was explaining before. The risk is that activities not perfectly linked to the heart of impact or to the frame of impact could be communicated as impact investments and being attractive more than other and traditional financial investments, but not being impact at all. They could create confusion in the market, and the risk of confusion for a jurist is something that could impact directly trustability of investments. So this is my starting point. And trustability is probably the key in order to support a better definition of impact economy. About SDGs, I think that SDGs could represent a step forward in order to create that frame, in order to understand at least the least common denominator of this field. But on the other hand, there is the opposite risk. I think that every day participating or attending webinar presentation and reading or going through PowerPoint presentation, we do have the SDGs cake or the table of the SDGs in every presentation we attend and we read daily. So my left hand say, okay, this is something really powerful because it's a way to create a common approach to something globally. But my right hands have to consider that the risk is that not all communication and activities linked to SDGs are really focused on the heart of sustainability. And this is for sustainability, which is easier as a definition than impact investment, because do not overlap the financial regulatory framework to that. To be more specific about SDGs, I think that the positive role that they can play is to accelerate the global debate about sustainability, impact definition, impact financial fields, social entrepreneurship, etc. You know that recently the B Corp system signed up an agreement with the United Nations in order to use SDGs better to regenerate the impact assessment accordingly to the SDGs. And this is something related to measurements. And this is, could represent a step forward in order to make a better definition of what measurement is, or a better way to measure impact generated by legal entities. Is not the final point, is not, you know, the finish of our run. It's only a starting point. And another time, the way expert will manage this possibility, this opportunity, and the possibility to represent the widest global approach is possible today. This could represent a success, a key for this sector success in the next year. But let me conclude, trustability is at the same time one of the keys of all the discussion that we are doing globally around this topic.
Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting that you're basically saying a bit of the same thing in terms of these broader goals, that you need someone to define those, but at the same time they need to be sort of filled with organizational experiences. You've been mentioning the B Corp certification as some sort of a network that could do this, but also obviously I would think that social entrepreneurship networks sort of based on the experiences that their organizations are having in measuring and sort of also illustrating impact would inform these bigger governance frameworks. Maybe let's, before we go more into that, let's take up Alexander Schilling's question. Alex, if you want to share that again, please feel free to unmute yourself, and if you want also put on your video, but you don't need to. As you said, you came in through Bildünger. I suppose that you're from Austria, but I suppose you'll let us know. So I'll just give the floor to you, because it's sort of a question that relates to how organizations can themselves make sense of this discussion, so to say.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, the question, I wrote it already. We are working with a school to completely change the way how students learn, and it's huge. It's everything that happens inside the school is different. But now, since all the people working in the organization are busy with just doing the work and maintaining what they're doing, we don't really have capacity to measure anything, right? And for such a small organizations like us, it's like really hard to even start measuring something. And even if you have just a few data points, how can it help you? So as I see it, the only way we can do this is actually to work together with universities or with other big organizations. Maybe Ashoka can help. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks very much. I'm totally sure Karl has an opinion on that.
Indeed, and it's a great question, because it picks up one of the prompts, Gorgi, that we haven't yet touched on, which is relating to organization, scale, size, and stage of development. And I think also they're talking about, some in your case, an organization with a very, very specific focus and objective, and therefore potentially an implied theory of change. If you haven't yet worked it out already, there's certainly an implied theory of change. And if you've worked a little bit through that, you have some sort of model that you're working towards. So maybe as an analogy or a contrast, I would just discuss briefly, think about different sizes of organizations, different stages of development in terms of their invoicing system. If you're dealing with a street trader, they may just negotiate a price and that's it. There's no piece of paper that gets handed over, but you agree. And on the other hand, if you're a really large multinational, you might have a very, very complex invoicing system and data system, and it's connected to all sorts of other systems within your organization, inventory, and so forth. So I think we need to also have a sort of a confident sense of what is appropriate for the organization and not try and do too much. And if we think about, sort of classic business management 101, you would talk in any context about, what is the mission of a business? And in describing a mission of a business, whether you're, this goes back decades, even before the impact debate was quite prevalent. You would be talking about things like, what is the reason I'm doing this? What is the need I'm addressing? Who am I selling to or providing something to? So you're introducing stakeholders. And what is the thing or stuff or service that I'm providing? So there will be some sort of assessment of that quality. And so I think it's quite, I find it quite comforting to then bring it back into that, those core foundation blocks of how an organization is being thought about. And it's, it helps maybe demystify the idea of impact management. So in that context, you've already outlined, that you have a very keen focus on, I'm just reading your comments in the chat, measuring students' self-efficacy and self-image. And if it's not easily quantifiable, as you say, then, that's something to potentially focus on and saying, well, okay, if that issue is really, really important, then how do we identify a few proxy indicators and get ourselves on a pathway where maybe in future we would have the benefit of, as you were saying, of academic institutions that could come in with much more statistical rigor, and you can maybe do things like randomized control trials where you look at your school versus another school or one class versus another class. And I'm just assuming people are familiar with those sorts of terms, but raise a question if you're not. But before you get to that point, I think that's where the skill of an entrepreneur comes in, which is how do we identify the proxies? And then using that to inform decision making. And as you grow, as you have greater resources to then evolve that. I think the challenge is that people often respond to what funders and investors and external parties want and ask for. And there's a real dynamic and tension there, which we need to honor. For example, you will need to have some degree of accountability to some sort of educational authority that is ultimately overseeing what's going on. And so there'll be, a very personal decision between how much do you spend on that kind of compliance reporting, as it were, compared with the developing a set of management accounts for impact that are relevant specifically to you and the mission. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope it sort of helps boost a bit of confidence as well in terms of seeing that you don't have to boil the ocean in terms of trying to do everything, but rather focus on the things that are really important.
Yeah, I would actually like to add a bit to what Karl has just been saying before I pass it on to you, Roberto, because I would be interested in hearing about your experiences of how this kind of information really goes also into contracts between investors and organizations, but also in this case could just be sort of assessment criteria by, as Karl was saying, an educational body that would need to be convinced of whether, Alex, your style of doing schooling or of rethinking the school is actually more effective than what we have at present. So what I can definitely say as someone coming from academia, I think there's tons of stuff that you can use. It's just hard to translate it, right? So there's tons of research and scales that you could use for self-efficacy measurement and other things. But obviously, I think what you actually need is often strong partners who can then help you sort of make the first steps, and especially as you evolve, then lift it up to maybe a higher level. But what I would also call everyone not to dismiss is the power of qualitative information, right? So you don't always need to think in randomized control trials in big quantitative studies. But what you could basically do is, in a systematic way, of course, it's not about testimonials, it's really about finding out, you know, what the pupils are saying, what the students are saying, what the parents are saying, and doing that in a systematic way in order to find out and also be able to illustrate, you know, what's the main benefit that you're producing in relation to you know, the standard intervention, so to say, school as we have it. And in that sense, also, I would always argue in favor of having a strong focus, right? Don't try to encompass it all and go into everything, because then I think your main message is quite weak. So I would get back to what Karl was saying. Think about your mission. Think about your sort of inherent theory of change. You might not have formulated it, but you have some ideas of what you're doing different and what kind of effects you expect to see. And focus on the things that you really think matter most, right? So what was your motivation? What are you telling people when you're telling them about your work? So what's the kind of things that you're stressing that you're doing differently, and then take it from there in order to work out step by step the value added that you're providing. I think that would be sort of my reflection from someone who sort of has a passion for doing it the right way and big and very precise and rigorous. But at the same time, I think you can just do that and build it up step by step without feeling overwhelmed. And also, one last message is that I would always see it as an investment into, you know, being also sure about that you're actually having the impact that you want to create, and being able to expand that rather than just, you know, a compliance thing, as Karl was saying, or a cost issue that you just can't do as a small organization. But maybe Roberto, you could flesh it out with some experiences in terms of how this goes into investor organization relations as well. And Alexander, of course, if you have any direct reactions, please feel free.
Starting from Alex's question, let me say that today working on KPIs in order to have the widest possible approach in order to measure activities run by NGO, social enterprise, or ordinary companies. It's the way that day by day is increasing those KPIs, you know, in order to better understand the final results generated by an organization as the one that Alexander is running. I mean, it's a way that is that we have to walk through day by day. And if I think to 2 years ago, to the first KPIs I managed for some agreement that I had to work on, the difference is incredibly high. I mean, it's a completely different world. From that table of KPIs to today, there is, you know, the sun and the moon, more or less. So it's a long way. We are walking through that way. So probably it's difficult today to be perfectly aligned with small organization. I do agree, and these small organizations are probably have to face a stronger cost. Sorry, something started in my computer, and the problem is that those costs today are difficult to be faced. But I am sure that in the next year this will be common for all organizations, from the biggest to the small NGOs. Coming to my experience, I do manage the clauses related to results, non-financial results connected to investments. This happened, for instance, when investors decided to fund an impact equity fund, and they are waiting, or they are looking for non-financial results in order to represent those results to stakeholders. And this is something that we will have to face in the next year daily, managing this kind of investments. I mean, this is something that we heard in the letter sent from Larry Finn to stakeholder of BlackRock in the last 2 years, probably is an approach to link to the markets, traditional market approach, but it's something representing a milestone in the way to include measurements in traditional equity investments. And that milestone in that world represents a huge change. Probably is not aligned to the definition of the impact that Karl would produce tomorrow coming from his studies or from his experience. I'm sure that they will not be aligned, but it's a sort of convergence to a direction where measurements could represent a way to better shape this market. So let me say that now daily I have to deal with this kind of clauses, and we do for investors, but at the same time we do for targets, because targets are perfectly aligned on the result, on the social results, on the impact results needed by investors, are the first to ask to be measured in order to represent their efficiency or their purpose or their commitment to join that result. So it's a way to tune two different needs, investors and targets. And obviously, my view, my perspective is the legal one. And obviously, the agreement is the place where you can deal with these clauses and you can draft the perfect alignment between investors and targets.
I think that's a very powerful additional message in the sense of, I mean, you're a strong observer and a detailed observer of the field, right? What I hear you saying is that it's coming. So it's going to be something that is part of contracts in the future, be they between investors or organizations. And I suppose also in the context of social impact bonds and these kinds of things, it would also be between the state and organizations, running these services. So better be fit for it, right? So it would be an additional incentive, sort of invest now into it and be someone who's able to maybe shape the field even, rather than having to react at some point when it's already there and you haven't really dealt with it in depth. But maybe Karl, you have something to add here as well.
Well, maybe a few things. I think it's really interesting when we think about and talk about the idea of contracts. And I couldn't help, Roberto, as you were talking about contracts, also think about the social contract. And I think going back to one of our previous discussions, reflecting from a legal perspective, you were saying things like, and I'm looking at you to interject with the correct language, but the different legal approaches. On the one hand, you might have a more one based on precedent and a legal system that evolves as different judgments happen, that then establishes a legal precedent that's very normative, and it's very much as similar to how social norms will evolve. And on the other hand, you have a more let's say top-down approach with developing harder and codified versions of legislation and regulation. I think those tensions emerge here, and they go back years and centuries, and I think it's really interesting to tap into that provenance here. I might also just expand the conversation, Gorgi, a little bit. I'm mindful to our discussion in Heidelberg, and I don't know if you've had Karen Kreutzer yet on the webinar, but she raised a really interesting point around the business model and trying to understand the interrelationship between impact and the business model. And I think particularly for maybe startups and small organizations, it's worth speaking about that a little bit. And thinking about, and for founders and entrepreneurs to think about, what is it that they're trying to achieve in terms of impact, and how does that relate to the commercial business model? Is it on the one hand integrated, so that as they scale the business, as they grow the business, as the revenues increase and the profits increase, so too does the impact? Or is there a trade-off model? And let's maybe pick two examples on that. An example where it would be an integrated impact and business model would be, for example, something like producing wind turbines, where the more wind turbines you produce, the greater your revenue and turnover and potentially profit as efficiency kicks in. So too would your impact increase as more and more people use your wind turbines and generate more renewable energy. So that's a very integrated model and easy to scale in a conventional sense. But you know, and I'm thinking there of maybe something related to, Alex, your domain. I'm not sure how it comes up in your field of work, but if you're, for example, educating children and there's you know, and you're working with kids with difficult learning needs, then you know, you might realize that to achieve those great educational outcomes, you need to put more effort in, and that generally comes with greater cost because you need to put more resource in, more one-to-one interaction. And so it's possible achieving those impacts, but potentially at the expense of you know, your business model, particularly if you don't have an income stream that is actually paying and incentivizing you around impact. And I think that's a really, really important point to understand in terms of how much of a challenge that then brings and puts on an organization. And again, it's down to the judgment of the leadership team in terms of how they balance those challenges.
That's great. I actually am just trying to promote some of the MOOC resources that actually talk to exactly these kinds of things. So I just pasted a couple of resources into the chat. So the first one is actually by Alyssa McDonald-Birtle, who's a social entrepreneur herself, running the Cacao Academy. And she's really talking about the need for evidence and her experience with, you know, being more of an activist, starting off more as an activist, and then realizing big business is never going to budge and policy is not going to change if I just tell my stories. I need some evidence and show that I have, you know, a superior model that I'm running on. The second that I just pasted in is containing Mario Calderini's statement, which is actually in conversation with Karl, where he's talking about if everything's impact, nothing is impact. And the third one is actually about the different alignments that Karl was talking about. So we actually have a graphic recording video where we're talking about these trade-off models, or whether this is in line. So I hope these are going to be good resources. I'm not sure whether Gianluca's turning on his video means that he wants to say something as well. It would be the sort of the concluding statement, but please feel free, Gianluca.
Yeah, it's not a conclusion. Sorry, I'm in a working space, and I was struggling to find a place where I could talk without really bothering everyone. So thank you, Roberto and Karl, for the interventions. I think it was very interesting. It's always a pleasure. Mine is not a conclusion, actually. It's more of a question. I don't know whether we have time to tackle it, but I was wondering when we were talking about materiality, and I was, thinking about these interrelations that is between impact thematic areas and economic activities, whether on top of setting standards for economic activities to be matched in order to be sustainable and to drive sustainability in industries that currently are not, I was wondering whether there are some systems in place to identify those new solutions or innovations that are additional, in a sense that, as Roberto was talking, additionality is one dimension that is particularly relevant. And I was wondering whether in this work, there's somehow like the additionality dimension is embedded somehow, and there are some processes in place to identify those solutions that can drive sustainability and are disruptive in a way, because they somehow change the way in which business practices are done. And just to give some materiality, some concrete examples, I was thinking about the example of Fairphone. So currently the IT industry is highly polluting, and I think we are very far from meeting the standards to be sustainable. But in a way, Fairphone is just providing a case of a business that is financially sustainable, providing profits, but also fostering a circular economy and sustainability in the industry. And this also might might also build the case, let's say, for other big organizations and corporations to follow this example. So are there ways to somehow discount these innovation disruptive factors in order to, basically accelerate the path towards sustainability of industries that are not sustainable right now?
Maybe just a quick round of reactions from all three of us before we close, because we're actually close to the scheduled time. What I wanted to share maybe as a direct reaction is that the German state is currently thinking about setting up a social impact fund with sort of nameless or otherwise lost assets, as we already have in the UK and in other countries, as you will know. And they're sort of grappling with this specific question in terms of how are investments going to be channeled, and thinking about how they can use best practice cases, as you were outlining, Gianluca, in relation to certain industries, in terms of where the investment is actually going to go. So I don't have any concrete solutions there, just describing that sort of the big governing actors as well are thinking about, how can we use this kind of evidence in order to draft both a scheme and also regulations in terms of where we're going to invest this money if the fund is being set up. But maybe Karl and Roberto, you have some reflections on this as well.
You want to go, Roberto, or? So maybe pick up one of the points you made, Gianluca, at the start, which I find quite interesting in terms of where potentially the innovation needs to happen in the context of materiality, and maybe to sketch out one of the challenges I'm trying to apply myself to, and this would be really interesting to pick up separately offline with people on the call what their ideas are, because I think if we look at the example we discussed before with or the situation with the EU taxonomy, and looking at using economic activity and sector and industry as a starting point to open up the signaling of what impacts our material, then I think we start realizing that the way we define our economic activity is actually quite restrictive when it comes to impact. And so we probably want to start thinking a little bit deeper about that. So, for example, if we think about a fishing industry, for example, it'd be very difficult to assign universal indicators across the whole of the fishing industry. What we do know there is if the fish are being then used for people to eat and consume, there's something there around nutrition and foodstuffs and so forth. If there are people involved, there's something about welfare and well-being of the staff involved. There's also an animal welfare issue, because ultimately you are killing animals. So what happens during the lives of those animals, and how are they looked after? What is the ecological impact if you're farming fish? And suddenly you realize, well, if you're farming fish, that's very different from, say, going out with a fishing trawler, where you might have a motorized vehicle, compared with, say, somebody standing on the bank of a river throwing in a line of fish. So what or a line into the water. So what we see is that we need to open up the industry into the underlying elements of activity to understand how those activities actually have material impacts. And so we need to go deeper than just a high-level industry classification. And that is actually the approach that the EU taxonomy is taking, and it's trying to then add on to our existing industry classifications, because we don't want to necessarily throw out the whole system that is obviously very entrenched, but you want to expand that. And I think also when we bring a data science approach to this, we realize that it'd be quite helpful if we could modularize all of this. So then if we use that example of the fishing, and we realize that there is a motorized vehicle going out there, a boat to a trawler to go catch fish, then that's a module that's maybe similar to any other motorized vehicle, a delivery vehicle, a taxi, your private motor car, and so forth. And maybe we can start looking at those things as opportunities to cluster certain indicators around.
Roberto, do you?
Yeah, I know we are late.
Yeah.
Only Two minutes. Firstly, it's every time that I hear at Karl's word, it's a pleasure, and so
likewise.
So it's so easily is able to define strong and difficult concept. So it's great. I'm fully aligned with Karl's word. Let me add something from my side, the legal side. I think that something, Gianluca, is happening through a soft law approach more than a hard law approach. Let me explain briefly. But hard law represents laws, regulation, something coming from the public sector. Soft law is the way that private companies, citizens, etc., regulate their activities. I'm sure that having in mind sustainability, impact, etc., these are fields that probably will be developed faster by soft law approach than hard law. I mean, when a multinational company decides to act in a specific way in that sector, cutting cost expenses for waste activities, or I mean, that's the way to join a result faster than waiting for a law. If another multinational company asks for its value chain to be certified and to be compliant with human rights, due diligence, etc., they would produce a higher result in the market than a specific law per each jurisdiction where this multinational company operates. So this is something that is linked to soft law. This is something that is linked to private companies or citizens. And just to conclude, another time, this is a question of trustability. And this is how consumers, how citizens can move the behavior from corporates to public sector. In some way, we assisted in the last 10 years how strong is the power of social network supporting a revolution, reaction, protest, etc. At the same time, this is part of the market linked to sustainability or impact that could have the same acceleration that we saw for social network in that situation. So I think that soft law is one of the key that we have to look at in the next year.
Thanks, everyone. So I think what we've just seen is that this is a super complex issue, but at the same time, we see the same pattern all the time. It seems to me that we need this bottom-up and top-down approaches meeting at some point. I mean, soft law that Roberto was just referring to was sort of codifying law by individual examples, right? Again, I think the good message here is that organizations can set these examples and then that they can really have an influence on what's happening in terms of the future governance criteria that are going to be in place in order to steer impacts into the right direction, so to say. So thanks everyone for participating. Thanks Karl and Roberto for your valuable insights, Gianluca and Alexander for your questions. I hope everyone enjoyed this webinar as much as I did. As promised, we're going to put it on YouTube so that it will find hopefully even more viewers and will be documented. Next week, we're going to have Georg Schön from Ashoka talking about scaling. And Alex Kesselring from Ashoka is going to be your host then. I'm going to email everyone and also promote it on social media. Thanks a lot for being with us. Thanks for taking the floor, Karl and Roberto. As we've made a motto here, this is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning. So this is sort of the standard saying for the MOOC webinar series. So please, everyone, feel free to get in touch offline, as Karl was saying, or online through social media or by email or whatever, and let's continue the discussion. So thanks very much, everyone, for participating, and hopefully see you soon.